Okay, good morning again. I think we'll get started. So thank you all for joining us for the 19th Annual Town History Series at the Patent Free Library. My name is Mary Kate Kwasnick, and I'm the Archivist and Special Collections Librarian in the Saginaw History and Genealogy Room at the Patent Free Library. The library is so excited to embark on this year's Town History Series today and over the next few weeks. And we're so happy that you could join us here today. Before I introduce you to today's speaker, I have a few important bits of information to share. I really want to thank all of the historical societies of our member towns for selecting our fabulous speaker and helping us get the word out. Thank you to Peter Goodwin and Robin Haynes, former history room managers and founders of the Town History Series. They've done so much to bring us to where we are today. Thank you also to Bath Historical Society for generously offering to professionally film each of the programs in this year's series. If you're with us in person today, please note that the speaker is being filmed by the camera at the back of the room, and just be cautious when you're passing by. This recording will eventually be available in our collection on DVD for anybody to check out. And the Zoom recording of today's program will be available on our YouTube page as early as next week. Finally, thank you to our audience. Thank you for building momentum for this series year after year and for showing up today, both in person and on Zoom. This is our first year back in person since 2020 and our first series that we're hosting both in person and on Zoom. So thank you in advance for your patience while we navigate our hybrid programs. Everyone is truly different from the next. If you're joining us on Zoom, please note that this is a Zoom webinar. So you cannot unmute or turn on your camera, but you can use the chat and Q&A feature. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A at any time during the talk, and at the end of the presentation, my colleague Jack will help get your questions answered. If you need to communicate with the library staff about any technical issues, you can also use the chat feature. And if your question doesn't get answered today, you're welcome to email us at history@patent.lib.me.us, and we can forward them on. This year's Town History Series is dedicated to Sheila Spear. Sheila volunteered for the History Room, indexing obituaries for our memory database, and she was the first town administrator of Aroustic until her retirement in 2022. At last year's Town History Series, Sheila represented Aroustic and presented the talk, Gift or Purchase, Relation to the Land, Aroustic, 1717. Sheila passed away this fall, and she was greatly missed by her community. Our speaker today represents the West Bath Historical Society. I'm pleased to welcome J.E. Paris Jr. Jay is joined by his wife, Phyllis, and Jay was a naval architect who has lived in Sabino since 1971, when he purchased the property that he's presenting on today. Both Jay and Phyllis have extensive marine backgrounds, and currently Jay is a yacht designer, and Phyllis owns her own consulting firm. And I just learned that Jay is the descendant of Albion Paris, who was the first full-term governor of Maine. Very interesting. Welcome, Jay and Phyllis.
Can we go back to slide number 1? Okay, I'm repeating perhaps a couple of things. But essentially, I'm from away. I came to Maine in 68 and then down to Sabino in 71. And I have some distant connections with Maine in that one of my predecessors, Albion Paris, as just mentioned, was the first governor of Maine to serve a full term. And then the architect, Alexander Paris, who's probably best known for the Bunker Hill Monument, the octagonal house at the Navy Yard, and such. Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't holding this properly. As the designed in Portland, the Cumberland Club. So that's my connections here. one of the challenges in doing this is, to some extent, you'll see in a slide where we've used the West Bath tax map. And my 50 years of serving on the planning board for West Bath, I often referred to the roads in West Bath, well, the maps themselves being somewhat mythical. Arthur Reno was known for moving a road just as he saw fit and never correcting any of the data on it. So he was interesting from there. The other thing that one needs to be aware of is there are numerous errors of omission and commission in the various deeds and surveys in the area that we call Sabino. So with that, we'll go to the next slide. This is a picture of the homestead dating from 1922. It got cropped, but there was a date written on it that was given to us by Dick Oliver. And one of the things that was interesting in figuring all this out, I didn't present it as a slide, but the Bates swapped land back and forth to a fairly well. For example, I'm paraphrasing a reference, but it says, in exchange for 1/2 of the sheep pasture, I grant you the north side of the woodlot. And when people died, they moved the ownership back and forth. But essentially, one of the important things you can see here is how wide open it was. And Wilbur Small, his mother, when I talked to her ages ago, said because there were no trees around, that from the small farm at the intersection of Quaker Point Road and I'm getting a little Berry's Mill Road, they could see down to this house. And from this house, they could see over to what's now the Lozier House. So they kept an eye on each other. And one of the challenges was that when I acquired this, the bank that had the mortgage, their lawyer said to me he couldn't figure out the title. So I spent a good portion of a month working out all the details of the title, looking at old deeds, etc. And then I turned it all over to the lawyer, who then published it on his letterhead and charged me a significant fee for that. So anyway, let's see what else I got here in my random notes. Block of trees. Yeah, I think that hits the high points of that.
And it's on Dam Cove too, correct?
Say again?
It's on Dam Cove.
Yes, to the north of this house, you have a view down onto Dam Cove. So what happened is after the Samuel F. Bates died, in due course, Delmar acquired title from all the heirs over a period of years and subsequently sold the homestead to Edward Larrabee Sr. in 1965. At some point about this time, it became lot 42. And then I purchased this from Edward Larrabee Sr. And as I said, that started me down the path to learning everything I have. I have in my collection quite a number of old deeds and some surveys, which in due course I'll turn over to the Historical Society. Next, please.
Mary Kate? I think I saw.
Okay,
Thanks.
this is how I define Sabino. And what I essentially did, and I will outline it here in red. Well, for some reason,
That's the microphone.
oh, that would help, would it? I appreciate having all these people around keeping me honest. Okay. Starting here at the end of Sabino Road, I defined it as coming up through Dam Cove, across this land,
Microphone.
right here, down along here, and down there, and along here, down to here, and then back out to Sabino Cove, perhaps you'd call it, and back to the point of beginning. This was all the land purchased by Samuel Flanders. In due course, he sold a piece to his brother James Famra, and their two land became the homestead of Samuel F. Bates and Charles H. Bates, and their holdings increased in size with acquisitions from abutters. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, going back even earlier, our surveyor, John Wood, made 4 sketch plans showing how it consisted of east-west strips of land from the river to the river. Essentially, in some of these cases, the Kennebec River was Winnebago's. And this is a crop of the 1761, and there are additional sketches from 1825, 1894, and 1992. And John Wood spent a lot of time going through this land, and it's he who identified all these stone walls. So, and these people will be able to come up and see, this is the 1760, the 1825, this is the 1894 and the 1992. And essentially, it's what I did in terms of cropping it. I just laid this one on the floor and took a photograph, and then changed the JPEG into a PDF. Next slide, please. John tried to find the original plan of all these divisions, and he could not locate it either at Lincoln County Courthouse or York County Courthouse. And the reason he went to York is the early records date from when it was part of Massachusetts. Okay, the next slide, please. This is pretty interesting for anyone working in this whole Casco Bay area. This is a very small crop of the 1870 U.S. Coast Survey chart. And what's fascinating, it shows the inland roads and a lot of property lines. And back at that point in time, Sabino Road, shown in red, either called Sabino Road or its precursor, was stopped at the Charles H. Bates homestead, now owned by Lozier. Sabino Road, in way of, excuse me, I'm losing my glasses. In way of the swamp, often flooded with the runoff from Campbell's Pond. An alternate approach was via a short suspension bridge from Quaker Point, as shown here in orange. What's interesting, kayaking in 1971, I found traces of the cables for that tiny suspension bridge. Wilbert Small's mother told me that one could hear an approaching horse and wagon clattering on the banks of the bridge. Queen Anne Street, now shown in green, ran southerly from Samuel Flanders' barn, which is now the Fahey barn, down towards Houghton Pond. And I restored the first 830 feet of the road in 2006. There were other ways that people got around Sabino in addition to roads. Sometimes at the end of Sabino Road, this is called Diamond Cove. And there were a number of ferry services with small ships, launches, etc. And one of the things when I had a housewarming in 1971, they said, how could you possibly live in this isolated space? And I said, well, it was one of the stories I was told was that you could take your grocery list down to meet the launch here, give it to the launch guy who took it up to the trolley at New Meadows Inn, who took it into Bath, and then a box was made up with everything you ordered, and that was given to the trolley that met the last launch coming down, and that was left here. So you could go down and get your groceries. So, Phyllis is saying about what year. I'm guessing early 1900s, but I don't have any exact date for that anecdote. I think it came from Delmar Base. Next slide, please. So there were summer colonies, and the first of them was the Bobtail Club, and that was founded by a group of Bath businessmen, which included Samuel F. Bates and Charles H. Bates. Since Sabino Road apparently did not exist from the Charles H. Bates homestead to the shore as of 1790 and maybe later, it's most likely that access to the shore was by opening and closing pasture gates to cross the lands of Charles and Samuel. And it's interesting that looking at a later deed, the one where Ed and Edna Lozier bought the land from Presley, who had bought it from Charles H. Bates, that there was, it says that easement is granted to the town across of the so-called Sabino Road. So even at that point in the 1960s, it was not recognized that Sabino Road was a town road, at least on the deeds. So a little bit of a challenge there. Next slide, and trying to define what the summer colony is. This is a crop of the 2013 tax map. And by this point in time, a number of these lots of small cottages had been combined into larger parcels with more substantial buildings. There's no record back when of what everything it was. Now, when I was doing my 1971 title search, I took all the references I could where it said that this lot was bounded on the north by X, etc. So I wrote these all down on little scraps of paper and ended up with sort of a jigsaw puzzle. And one of the things that I found, and I spoke at one point to the Sabino Improvement Association, I said, one of the lots is a 99 lease from our property. If you have trouble with a title search at some point in history, feel free to come to us and we'll grant you a quitclaim deed. So, can we carry on the next slide?
You are ahead
Okay, John Wood took all the data that he got in these things and used it in coming up with his survey. And this is essentially the 40 acres that we bought, of which a portion was this piece down here of 18.54 acres. And one of the things is that the land west of here was originally that of Charles H. Bates, now Edward Larrabee Jr. via CHB to Presley to Edward Larrabee Sr. And the land easterly of Parrot is that also of Charles H. Bates. That's this land over in here. And that is now Michael Lozier, acquired by Charles H. Bates to Presley to Edward and Edna Lozier. I have focused to a large degree on, as I said earlier, the lands of Samuel F. Bates and Charles H. Bates. There are some people who might wish to include the Lee Farm, which was up in here, which in 1971, was occupied by Nancy and David Hall. And other people might wish to define the land going further south to Houghton Pond. It's, I know from faces and names I've seen, all the people in this area up in the Lee Farm and down towards Houghton Pond are not ostracized and saying they can't join the Sabino Improvement Association. So it's a fairly eclectic point. Dig down. Okay, next slide was how in bloody blazes were
Microphone.
we able to find what the boundaries were? And it's pretty interesting. As I say in my last bullet here, this technique has only been observed by me on the land owned by Samuel Flanders and Samuel F. Bates. What they did was every 15, depending on the layout, 5, much as 20 feet, they would take a star drill and drill a 3/4 inch hole down into the rock. And then a iron rod was driven into the hole and a pre-drilled fence post was dropped down on the road. The rods all still exist. Over the years, I've painted them, all of them bright blue, since it's a color that doesn't occur naturally. And a few of the posts still remain somewhat degraded with short lengths of barbed wire attached. As I've said, both Samuel Flanders and his grandson had no interest in farming. They were primarily engaged in raising cattle. Purington states that they thought nothing of driving their animals to the Topton Fair. So there are a couple other interesting things. If you today go in the Brophy driveway through an existing gap in a stone wall, to the west of that driveway is a stone ramp that I presume was probably used for loading cattle onto carts or something of the equivalent. Another thing of interest was in terms of them using all this as pasture land. Phyllis, if you could hold up the terracotta pipe. When we were digging holes to bury stumps that had been sort of dug out from what became the Brophy land, and then Jason Shaw, who was doing the digging 5 or 6 feet down, broke into a length of this pipe. And that pipe, once it was broken, the hole immediately filled up with rusty water. And so again, I reached some of these conclusions. What that did was kept this portion of pasture land from not flooding, because there was what looks like a spring further up, and then it took all that water via this pipe under the pasture and exited where the land drops away down to Dam Cove. Now, there's a lot of iron around here. Both at our original house with now Fahey, if the rust filter wasn't working, you could have 2 inches of water in the tub and you couldn't see your toes. So a lot of people have to invest in fairly significant filtration, rust removal technology to end up with reasonable water. What used to occur is at the Fahey house is in the spring, there would be a rust stain, maybe 20 feet in diameter, that would come out. And got rid of some of this by burying drainage pipes that sort of collected some of this water and then ran it on down. Excuse me a sec. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Okay. I first became aware of Queen Anne Street while doing the title search. And a deed for a portion of the south parcel dated 1894, which
That's the microphone.
well, that's why it doesn't light up. This is this lot. This was formerly Greenfield over here, and in his deed, it said that he had a right of way on Queen Anne Street. And so Queen Anne Street, at least from here, and you may recall that I said earlier it left the Flanders barn, now where the Fahey barn exists, and ran down further south than this. But this portion was still very much apparent in 1971 and still so in 2006 when I restored it from here to here with culverts draining this wetland. Next, please. Okay. Can we flip back just for a second? This wetland is shown here. A very small portion of this wetland right there. If we can go back to the slide, please. Had standing water over approximately 8 feet of accumulated dead leaves. And I could run a stiff stick down into that. And I'm guessing that this was the prior fire pond that would have been necessary for raising cattle. And the reason Queen Anne Street was probably important is it provided a more level route that avoided the steep grade on the present Houghton Pond Road that may have been a challenge for horse-drawn wagons with heavy loads to construct Houghton Pond's dam and to transport ice. And again, one of the things you could find early on was the cable system going down to the shore and the eye bolts to where the schooners were tied up to load ice, which probably went, you know, could be as far as India. So, and today's portion of Houghton Pond Road that is close to the shore with that steep slope may date to after 1887. Now you'll notice in my talk that I make a number of assumptions. I think they're reasonably well educated, but I can't give you 100% assurance. Oh, we're running ahead of time.
What you might want to do is come back to this slide and talk about the military.
Okay.
And the other one is those you wouldn't cover.
Okay. My manager is suggesting we go back to the beginning. Okay, here is a big willow tree, which is mentioned by Purington. And essentially, it was, Purington states a young boy stuck a willow stick in the stick in the ground, which turned into the stately willow tree. Now, what's interesting, in 1922, this was pretty open land. By 1935, when Samuel F. Bates died, it was probably still pretty open. But after that, things were not maintained at all. And Bill Haggett told me as a young man, and this is probably in the 40s and 50s, he would go down to Houghton Pond Road and no one realized this house was here. All this had grown up so significantly. That was, the case here. Delmar Bates, who sold this land to Ed Larrabee Sr., also told me a number of anecdotes that on the north side of Sabino Road in World War II, there were victory gardens that were leased from the Samuel Vanders property, or the heirs who were managing it, to provide additional food for all those who were interested. We subsequently, this house looked very much like it did when I purchased it in '71. However, there are major differences. This chimney had long since disappeared. The foundation down here was huge granite stones, but the top 18 inches, was brick, and not very well fired brick, because it was crumbling to some extent. And so one of the things, and then under this section of the house, the floor joists are logs flattened on top. And then this probably had small animals kept in it, and their hooves had worn away the flooring, leaving the knobs standing fairly proud. There was a dug well over in this area, which, to keep people from falling into it, I built a little shed roof over it, and we use that in times of drought to do some watering for our garden. And let me think, out in here is where the rust stain would appear. And the inside of the house, which had, in this same section, had 3 rooms, was opened up into one room. And as a result, we had to go buy some guided missile launcher rails to build in to keep the upstairs walls from sagging down. They had dropped about 2 inches. So we rigged lolly columns and jacked everything up, and then boxed them in with wood so that they looked like original beams. Oh, good. A strange thing is that people often, when they put a beam in and show it with all sorts of scallops, that would be indicative of rather lousy woodwork. a guy with a broad axe could make a beam back then look absolutely smooth. For some reason, people get fascinated by all these scalloped beams. Oh, interesting little detail here. In 71, needed a place to park my 37 Buick. And so I hired a very friendly French-Canadian guy to assist me. And we put some gravel in here, drove the Buick in, and then built a shed roof over the Buick. And then we dropped the walls from the shed roof and in due course dug out under those walls and put in a foundation. But I can't remember his name. He thought this was all very logical. And it served until we actually built the barn over in this area. There are a lot of along in here and coming up along the present edge of the Fahey things are remnants of apple trees. And one interesting apple tree, which is in this area here in 71, I don't know how many people have read the books of, I don't remember his first name, Sloan, Eric Sloan. He talks about how apple trees move down a hill over time. And essentially, we witnessed that here. Essentially, the original tree collapsed down slope, took root, grew up again, collapsed, and went down slope. So that was, I forget which one of his books that's in, but he's got a picture of how that all evolved. You see a few really large trees here, and they generally show up on the boundary lines. And again, going back to 71, working down over this hillside, I found a number of stumps at least 3 feet in diameter that must have been logged at some time, maybe fell down after a cut into a frozen dam cove and then dried out and somehow in due course made it to a sawmill. And but in addition to that apple tree here, there were some pear trees here. They worked at being self-sufficient. However, they were not very good at cleaning up after themselves. In 71, I hired a friend who had a dump truck, and we took 14 loads of trash, including some 40 to 50 tires. And another thing that we saw is you can't see it here. When I first came in, there was an outhouse on the backside of this. And it was a 3-holer, father, daddy, father, mother, and one hole for the little one. And so what I did was, before I built the bathroom over that area, I poured a slab, but the rhubarb grew like crazy. Where the old outhouse was. It really liked all that nutrient. So, how am I doing on?
Unless you have more to share. Mary Kate, how do you want to orchestrate the Q&A portion?
We can take questions and I can take the mic around so that everybody can hear the question. If Jay's ready.
Say-
I've got some people who are going to raise their hand in caution, so
Okay.
they're gonna make you work some more.
Maybe I'll go up to the podium, so I can face the people attacking me. Okay, Rory, I do recognize someone, what, you have a question?
Yeah, how old do you think the original house is? I mean, is it 1922 or is it?
The house probably is 1840
Okay.
or something. I'd use a laser to point at you, but that's told not good practice.
Still following the same thought, is the L older, that second section of the house older than the first one? You spoke about squared logs on,
Right, that was the oldest section of the house, and the section over the large rectangular main portion, that whole floor had collapsed into the basement. At the same time, that chimney disappeared. And that's when I had to put in the guided missile launcher thing, hold the thing on up. Yeah.
Herb, Jim Drake. Would you talk a little bit about what businesses were in Sabino? Was it just ice? Were there any small boat yards there? You said there was a ferry pier or
That was just where the ferry stopped. I'm not aware of much in the way of businesses. However, in all of West Bath, if you look in the Purrington book, you will find there were a large number of hotels in West Bath.
Oh, we had one on Bridgepoint Road
Right.
that burned, but you know.
Mhm. Oh, they seem to get torched with some degree of regularity, by people who, thought that was a fun thing to do.
So it was ice that really drove the.
At Houghton
Other
Pond.
than passengers, yeah, okay, thank you.
Jenny Freeman, there's a section of the barn that shows, but I remember a much larger barn. A long time ago, and it wasn't recent, it was much longer ago than when the Paris's lived there.
Well, there was the Samuel Flanders barn, which shows up on that thing, and that foundation was still there in 1971, and that's the road where Queen Anne Street departed from and ran south. And amongst the stuff I had to part away was all the remnants of that original barn. And there was a smaller foundation there, but in making the access ramp up to get into the barn, we ended up covering some of that. But they certainly had a fair bit of capacity in their barns.
Yeah, I remember seeing a sleigh in part of it and a big hay mound and cattle stalls and rings in it, and it didn't look like that little corner that's there. And also there was a big catalpa tree, and I was wondering when that came down.
Well, catalpa is pretty interesting. I'm into woods in all sorts of respect. The catalpa is, the northern catalpa is indigenous to a short stretch of the Missouri River, but every spring it has fairly spectacular flowers. There's one up by Skilling's greenhouse there, and they're fancier than, say, a horse chestnut. but we ended up cutting that catalpa down when we built our garage. But because they were so flowery, they were taken from that short stretch of the Missouri River and planted to a fairly well all over the place. And the other reason I'm intrigued about catalpa is it and locust are the most rot resistant woods in the road. And we have some catalpa in our 32-foot long sloop. It's remarkably lightweight and remarkably hard and amazingly durable. But that tree was responding to signs of stress. So when it came time to take it down, I'm trying to remember the guy from Rousick who had the portable sawmill. Bart, you remember?
Red Carl, and we took it down in the mid-90s.
Right, and we cut all that stuff up into wood, and that wood's still with some of it living in the top floor of our present barn.
Do you remember the time, the date you took it down approximately?
It came down, Jenny, probably about the mid-90s,
Okay.
because we were extending the house on the western end to put in a garage.
Thanks.
And when Fred came to carve up the tree, or cut up the tree, I should say, it had a lot of lightning strikes. It was pretty obvious.
Yeah.
And the other thing that was interesting was we parked our cars just to the south of that tree, and the roots didn't like that sort of treatment. One of the things we found when we built our present house, 2005, is that whenever one drove near a white birch, they didn't like that at all. So we lost a huge number of white birch. Roy?
Yeah, the other interesting thing, I think, about the catalpa tree was it would drop all its leaves almost within a day or so. I mean, it was just,
In the fall, after
Yeah.
the first
yeah.
Yeah, well,
all at once.
we would refer to that as fall. Because after the first frost, when the sun came up and hit that tree, all the leaves would be down in an hour. And that's what we call fall. Our present catalpa tree is not so timely.
I have one more question. I've been in the little summer kitchens section a long time ago when I was a kid. And I don't know whether you're aware of the well that was heading toward Dam Cove that was right in line with that summer kitchen, because I remember there was a pump and can pump. And I didn't hear you mention a well back there.
I specifically remember the dug well, which was easterly of the 1922 house. Often these places had a hand pump inside the house where they could pump water, but I saw no evidence of that per se in 1971. However, we modified that interior section of the house in way of the kitchen. After a number of years of trying to convince Phyllis to think of it as a big galley, she decided we needed something more. So what was my office to the east of that summer kitchen, we created a more normal facility.
been talking about the rhubarb patch.
I did talk about that being downhill from the three-holer. Rory,
Yeah, one other question. Queen Anne Street, did it exist earlier than the formal Sabino Road? In other words,
Queen Anne Street is shown in the 1870 chart. It's not Queen Anne Road. The town insisted that when we recreated it, we couldn't call it Queen Anne Street because, you know, a private road had to be a lane or something like that. And I pointed out to the town that it's already labeled on their maps as Queen Anne Street, and they backed off on that. So it's still today, Queen Anne Street. And
but was there more traffic that was directed to the water and to boats than there was up Sabino? And were people crossing property to get to
the shore,
the shore? Yeah.
right, but in 1870, Queen Anne Street is shown, but Houghton Pond Road does not show up in 1870. So I'm guessing, I think there's a note in one of the slides that Houghton Pond Road probably dates from 1887, when the Bobtail Club and such started the summer colony.
Thank you.
No one else? Oh, hello, sir.
Um,
Have I said anything improper about your house, man?
You did it justice.
that's all public knowledge now. I heard the word sleigh right near the wellhead that you built the roof over. Is an old sleigh that I totally grown in with vines and everything that I always wanted to pull out of there and restore it, but I don't dare. 'Cause as soon as I do that-
Were you referring to a sledge or a sleigh?
Well, this is a pretty big thing that might be used for hauling lumber,
So a sledge.
whatever.
Yeah,
It had-
there was a sleigh around. And for a number of years, we had it parked in front of the house, as sort of a Christmas-like decoration. But there was also in the woods, a sledge, which, you know,
This
was,
thing would have been wagon size.
yes.
Yeah.
And, you know, one or a team of horses would drag fairly heavy loads and even supplemented with rollers to utilize.
And you mentioned near there, you mentioned a ramp of stone.
Yes,
Is that possibly associated with an old town?
no, it's a ramp. I would say, correct me if I'm wrong, Jim, but I'd say it's north-south is about 20 feet and east-west is 5, 6, 7 feet. And I figure that was for getting stuff up onto wagons. And it's associated with a break in the stone wall. So that says there was another road coming from Sabino Road through the break in the stone wall and passing by this thing I'm referring to as a ramp.
Lastly, you can tell me about the dumpster.
Say it again?
You can tell me about the dumpster, all of the bottles of the.
Oh,
Tradition.
yeah, right. And as I told you, they just scattered stuff around. And sometimes they opened the back window and threw bottles out. But they also had a little bit to the east, a dump. And the thing that was remarkable in going through the dump is an incredible number of vanilla bottles, the dark brown sort of bottles. Well, during Prohibition, there was nothing against vanilla extract. So a fair number of people would imbibe in vanilla extract. And so as a result, an enormous collection of those dark brown bottles. Well,
Jay, we have
no
one,
one else wants to pick on me?
No.
Or do we have any questions from the field?
not a question, but one nice memory. Annie writes, I remember my dad bringing me to the cables of the trestle bridge between QP and Sabino in the mid-60s. I have a picture of it with two great aunts standing on it. Just a nice memory.
Ah, very good point.
Yeah, well, it was interesting in 71. Kayaking up to the head of Dam Cove to going past the dam and turning easterly, right at that small gap was where I found the remnants of cables. And I have not mentioned much about Dam Cove, the dam at Dam Cove. And it's my understanding that some of these, and maybe that one, operated in two modes. What they would do is that they would close the dam off at high tide, trapping all that water to the north of the dam. And then when the tide came out, they would use that to power the grindstone, etc. And then in some of these, and maybe this dam as well, at dead low tide, they would close the dam off. And then as the tide came up close to high, they would let the water come back in to flood the upper regions of Dam Cove. I believe what's Dick Totten's brother's name? Larry Totten has a grindstone that may very well date from that period of time. So, again, I've come across no references to whether that was agricultural or sawing timber, etc.
I have one more, Jay. Chester writes, there were 6 gates needed to get from Barry's Mill Road. Were they slip rail ones? Where were they?
Say again, please.
There were 6 gates needed to get from, I think, Barry's Mill Road. Were they slip rail ones? And where were they?
I'm not following the question exactly.
It might be the gates crossing property.
Oh,
Yeah.
Property gates you cross through to get down to Sabino.
yeah, I have no reference to what those gates were, and it's a supposition. Again, one of my suppositions that because it was pasture land with cattle, I'm just presuming that they were sort of normal pasture gates that had to be opened and closed as you went through. Sometimes in England, you see stiles where people climb up to go over a pasture fence and down the other side. But that seems to me to be an English phenomenon and not one from here.
I heard the partial story about the gates. I understood that there were 7 gates, but 6 or 7, they're pretty close. But I wondered if they were in conjunction with all the stone wall partitions along the road And I tried to count them to see, well, that might have been where the gate was, but, you know, some of them are kind of disappeared into the woods, so.
7 sounds a bit high, but using the traces of stone walls, I can imagine that there were definitely more than 3. But again, it's tough to find written references of this. And Purington's book, a look into the history of West Bath, is sort of slightly erroneous in places. For example, he talks about when Samuel Flanders bought Sabino, and he says that, I think about 1870, but if you go to the Lombard cemetery and look at the inscription from his gravestone, he died and was born in 71. It's trivial, but you know, sometimes people don't do fact checking back and forth between the front and the back of the book. Well, maybe we're at time to allow people to escape. I will. I didn't do it here, but sometimes when I give a lecture, I started by saying, it's my job to speak to you today on subject XYZ. It's your job to listen to me. If by any chance you finish your job before I finish mine, feel free to leave.
Thank you.